COVID-19 has changed the world. I'm interviewing extraordinary people on the front line, stepping up with amazing acts of kindness in the fight against this virus. Tune in to watch, support and share their inspiring stories, because together we are stronger.
So, Alessandra and Mike, thank you so much for joining me today on this special COVID edition of my show. It's lovely to have you both.
Thank you.
Would you like to explain what you're currently doing and how your business has changed with the current pandemic that we're seeing?
Yes, well, during this pandemic and in general, we consult and supply direct the end user for PPE and medical equipment. So we are pivoting in the middle. We are the go-to company to supply and the equipment.
The PPE equipment.
Yeah.
And we use all of the global contacts that we've built up over many years on consultancy and using them for supply, sourcing, and procurement.
And what are you finding the main challenges at the moment with either the supply and the demand of the PPE equipment?
I mean, at the moment, and it's changing all the time. I think it ranges from political right the way through to understanding what it is that's actually being required. And I think to understand that, you need to understand that what PPE is.
Yeah.
So,
can you explain a little bit more, Mike or Alessandra, about that? Because there is
personal protection equipment, which doesn't include things like ventilators, UV lights, and those are other things that we do, but they're not included in PPE. So PPE is basically going from head to foot, looking at goggles, visors,
masks,
coveralls, any kind of face mask. And within the face masks, there are many different types of face masks. And I think it's important to say that within that range, you can go from the top quality, which is a 3M mask, down to something that's produced locally down the road in your town, which is happening now.
Well, actually, I was going to
a huge range in the middle.
Yeah, and to that point, Mike, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people, and there are so many communities that are trying to help out of kindness and are making their own PPE equipment and sort of giving them out to key workers, etc. What are your views around that?
I think it's a very important thing to do. However, there is a massive distinction. So within that PPE environment, there is a massive distinction between what is a civil usage and medical usage.
Yes.
So even if we're procuring that from any of the countries that manufacture it, we still need to be very clear about what's the usage for it. Because if it's medical and surgical use, it is made from very clearly different materials than a civil usage. And I think the problem is that people give out the wrong wording to that, because a mask is a mask, but it isn't really. It's what's in a mask that counts. And so it's very clearly, if someone's manufacturing something at home, it must be approved for the use in a medical environment. So when we source masks, first of all, we need to know what type of mask it is. And as I said, there's 3M, which is the pinnacle of mask manufacturing, down to something locally manufactured. But within that, there are lots of different masks, and they do lots of different things. And I think it would be too long to go into those in detail. But when you have something locally manufactured, it won't have a CE certificate or approval, and it won't have, for example, if we send something to America, it must be FDA approved, which is Food and Drug Administration. So those kind of approvals, must be in place with anything that's locally manufactured. And of course, with the speed that things are happening, they're going not in the right way.
I mean, it recently was in the news actually that there was equipment being delivered that was substandard, that wasn't meeting the safety checks.
Well, again, we go back to procurement. So when you procure something, if someone comes to me and says, I need to buy a mask, first of all, is what's the use? What's it being used for? Is it medical or is it civil?
Yeah.
Once we know that, we know what we're looking for in terms of approval. Once we go through the whole process, and it's a very defined process about, sending letters of interest, making procurement notices, completing an LOI, completing the purchase order and everything like that, right into the point where it's purchased. Before you actually pay any money, you must get what's called an SGS certificate. And an SGS check is done at the very final point before it's shipped to make sure what's in the box is what it says on the box. Or more than that, it is what you are procuring. Because if the two don't match up, then obviously you're not going to buy them. It's sort of like, I want to have that car, and you go down to the garage and you go, no, it's a different color than one I ordered.
It's a green Mini, not a red, whatever.
So it's important to have those tests, and I'm not going to criticize anybody in any case, but you must test everything before it's shipped.
And who are you mainly supplying to? Is it hospitals or is it other frontline workers?
Mostly NHS and private sector, care home, and obviously foreseen for the future, the long end perspective of wearing masks would obviously open many other sectors that goes beyond the medical and the care zone and the civil use. So it would be obviously.
I think the market's changing all the time.
Every day.
Because with the if you like, the medical side is going to require this moving forward, I would say, over the next years. There have been masks, if we're just talking about in the UK, which have gone out of date. So they have to be replaced because you need to have a stock, because you don't know when the next occurrence of some other virus is going to happen. So all of those stocks will need to be replaced. And they're mostly medical, if I'm not mistaken. But on the other hand, you're going to find that large industries and companies will want to purchase this type of equipment.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Simply because the government's saying you as an employer must look after your staff, which is absolutely correct. But they, as industry or manufacturing or just employers, will have to order this kind of equipment. We don't we don't do small volumes. So you have someone in the middle that's supplying those small volumes. We're really looking at anything from 5,000 upwards to millions.
Why do you think there was such a shortage at the beginning, certainly in terms of the equipment? We weren't getting the equipment through quick enough.
It's a difficult question to answer, but without getting political about it, I think that the virus moves very quickly and it's changing very quickly. And at the beginning, perhaps there was a belief that, well, it's not going to get us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
It was a long way away in China. It rapidly came here, and nowadays these things just can turn around in days. At the same time, it was almost the perfect storm, because you had many other countries all looking for the same product out of only one supply area, which is China. So everybody was trying to get the same product out of the same place, and it just became impossible.
So all your supplies are coming from China, and as I understand, is that right?
I would say, in percentage terms, you cannot nowadays. China, and this is another subject, another time. But China is where we supply everything from nowadays. Rightly or wrongly, that's what's happened. And the only country that perhaps could be said not to do that to some extent is Germany, because Germany had a lot of manufacturing of their own medical equipment. But 9 out of 10 countries all go to China because it's available. Malaysia produces a certain amount of things like nitrile gloves, aprons, things like that. Vietnam produces masks and certain other items such as nitrile gloves and other PPE, let's call it. But China is the largest producer of them.
Interesting.
Other than you have 3M factories all over the world, actually. But because what happened during the beginning of the virus, once it hit the USA came into the market massively and basically caused a vacuum in the market, and 3M masks were very hard to get. I mean, they're very hard to get now, but they became even harder to get hold of because the US had basically procurement teams buying everything they could. But yes, the productivity of China is still got to be around the 70%.
So you're supplying globally. What are you seeing in the different countries? Where are you seeing the biggest demand from at the moment?
To some extent, you could say the bigger the country, the more demand.
Well,
or rather, the larger the population, the larger the demand. Of course, America is the largest one, and you're talking in billions there of masks.
Yeah.
If we just talk about masks, and that's pretty much what we are talking about, they are in the billions, perhaps hundreds of billions. So, because a mask doesn't last longer than the wearer's usage of it, really. So, in a medical environment, and I'm not a medical person, but I know that they are used. I mean, realistically, you shouldn't be reusing it after you've been involved with something or someone with the virus.
Okay, so
it's a very once used in the bin type product. Whereas when you have a public use, it can be reused more times than one, obviously. So the volume, just to go back to your question, primarily I would say the United States. After that, the UK, and then you've got Asian countries as well. You've got other Asian countries that Korea, for example, produces its own. Japan tends to produce its own. Germany has been buying. Most of Europe has been buying. Africa, to some extent, but the African market, I would say, hasn't really. I'm not going to say it hasn't reached there yet, but I think it's still to happen.
Wow. Okay.
It is developing, of course, as we have had some inquiry from Africa, and he's going obviously that way.
I think also the Indian market is somewhat insular because India closed down completely, wouldn't import, wouldn't export. They produced all their own masks, and they have really closed down India. In the next 10 days, India will start to open up. They will start exporting masks to only government procurement.
What do you think your biggest challenges are at the moment? Obviously, this must have changed the way you're doing business, or certainly in terms of the demand. Are you working longer hours? I mean, how are you finding it?
Yes, I think we do in different level, like we were saying before, because there is the interaction between different countries, and because also everyone now is working from home, so there is like no time at all, because like last night we were up till 12 o'clock doing documents, and that is now an open market globally. And the time is is affecting us the way in which we work, and yes, it is definitely changing the way we do business.
I think to answer that question, you need to break it down into. The problem is that you aren't just looking at supplying somebody with one item.
Mm.
You're talking potentially millions of mask procurement. You're talking about a lot of different nationalities involved in one particular purchasing chain. And after that, you're talking about the supply chain. So that means transportation. And the whole of the transportation industry has changed unrecognizably since
How are
it
you
ever
actually,
started. So
how are you actually transporting? Obviously, planes, I guess, are pretty much.
when this first started, to charter one aeroplane, roughly for about 100 tons, went doubled in price within days, because there were not the charter flights available. Other people wanted to charter the flights, so obviously supply and demand, the price went through the roof. So flights are a premium. Courier services have subject to quite big delays. So where you may have normally expected to ship something to, say, New York from China within 2 days, normally, now can take 7 to 10 days.
Wow.
So there's a massive difference in so expectations are, yes, if I order it now, I can have it in 2 days. No, you won't. Because first of all, they have to manufacture it. So the lead time on manufacturing now is probably, if you ask me for 1 million masks today, it would probably take 10 days to actually have them available. And then you've got to ship them, and that will take probably another week.
Are the government ordering enough in advance?
I think everybody's ordering whatever they can as fast as they can all the time. And that, to come back to where we started,
Yes.
it really means that we're working against different time zones. So as soon as I'm getting up, Chinese are already coming to the end of their day. So if I've got an order put through, they've got to process that order overnight, so that in the morning I have the process that I can then explain to, say, America 8 hours later when America starts to open up. So there are lots of different time zones involved and a lot of transport issues, actually. And the transport issues are not going to get better, they're going to get worse.
Yeah.
Because companies are going to go out of business. We know that already.
Yeah, the airline.
There'll be less availability.
Yeah.
Mm.
And sea freight is too slow.
In terms of other equipment, I believe you also supply or procure testing equipment.
Mm-hmm.
How has that been taken up? Because I know now the government is, or certainly here in the UK, is now finally saying that they're going to get more testing equipment, and there has been a lack of testing equipment.
I think you have to define a test. What the governments do are somewhat different to a rapid test, which we can supply.
What are the rapid tests? Just talk me through that.
Well, a rapid test kit is basically, without getting too technical, it's an IgM test. And to say it in its briefest terms, it is basically taking plasma samples or blood samples. It's putting it onto real sort of basic chemistry stuff, but onto a piece of litmus paper, and it measures the whether or not you have the virus or had the virus. Okay. So depending on the scale that comes out on the rapid test kit, depends on whether you look as if you may have had the virus, or you are, let's say, free of the virus. Because it depends on the antibodies that you have in your blood. And as I say, I'm no expert on it, but it takes about 30 minutes to do that test. Now, we could say a lot of things that they should or shouldn't have, and they could give them out, and they could do a lot of things. At the moment, the problem is that science is moving much faster than the approvals that are being given out for it.
Okay.
So I can only tell you, so with regards to the USA, to get FDA approval takes longer than the science is moving forward. So in fact, the test kits now that we look at shipping are still in process for getting the approval from the FDA.
Of course.
So that's the problem, because then when you arrive at customs, they'll say, well, have you got approval? No, we haven't got approval. So there's also a bit of politics involved with that too.
Do you think the governments are doing enough?
What I think and what the government thinks might be way apart, but I would like not to comment on that one. I do believe that they need to really look at their procurement briefs. I think it's very difficult for people like us and many other companies, and it's nothing that you haven't seen on the news, where companies have tried to get in touch with the government, and it has been quite difficult to say, yo, we can give you this product, we can give you this product. It's a difficult process, believe me.
But again, it's coming back to approval and way of, getting contact and procurement chain. It's all, when it gets to a government level, all gets obviously
it's
and require more documentation, more time. So yes, it is not as easy as dealing with a private care home where you can go.
I think,
although it has been difficult at the moment.
I think that the issue today is the care homes, more perhaps than the actual hospitals.
Yes.
So, and care homes come into a very grey area, I would say. And also, when you talk about care homes, I mean, we've been in touch with, people who are the National Care Home Association and people like that. But there isn't one body that procures for all the care homes. Now, you could say there's that the government, but government, probably there are a lot of private care homes around, and therefore it comes into this grey area. And I think the public are seeing that now, because, well, what happened to the care homes?
Well, exactly.
My only thought with that would be that if there was a learning curve to learn from this, would be that somehow or other those care homes en masse need to become a lot more joined together in how they procure their items. Because, of course, if you're a small care home, you may only want to actually purchase, 1,000 different masks. Whereas if you're en masse, you can procure millions at a much cheaper price.
Of course. I think that's a very, very valid point you've made there, Mike. Maybe there needs to be some sort of body, as you say, they're all separate at the moment, a lot of different private care homes, where actually is there a governing body or some sort of, safety standard that can do this procurement as well. Are there any other, what do you foresee for the future?
A lot more work.
I'll send you my book. I'll send you my book.
Or let's put it this way, let's end on a positive note. What lessons do you think we can learn from this?
Well, I think the future holds lots of changes, and I think, all of us around the world, actually. And I can talk to colleagues of mine and friends of mine between New York, China, and throughout the Middle East, and they will all say the same thing, that the world has changed and it's a new world order now. The whole of the procurement process, I believe now that it's a bit like the retail business. The retail business, up until 8 weeks ago, was working as it was. We'd go to our shopping centres, we'd do all these things. Now it has come rushing up to the point where suddenly there's a massive problem in the retail and people won't go back. So it's similar in procurement, because the length of supply chain has been now found to be too long. And we've some of us in the business have been saying that for many years, that supply chain's too long. It takes you 35 nowadays, because by sea, it's taking about 35 days from China to the UK. Too long. So shorten supply chains, that means moving manufacture closer to the country that wants to procure. And that's with lots of things. It's not just in PPE medical equipment. And I think at the same time, public's changing the way they purchase, how they work. Everybody's working from home. That means that more people will be procuring from their
internet
phones at home.
Yeah, exactly.
But you'll expect it to be delivered next day.
Yeah, of
So
course.
that means keeping a higher inventory. So that, coming back to what you were asking before, higher inventories will have to take over, because what we used to call just-in-time process, it's not going to happen anymore. And everything's going to get more expensive. And one thing, going back onto PPE, whatever we say is the price today can change rapidly by tomorrow. So that's why everybody's urged to sort of say, yeah, okay, we buy it today. I know in China there are teams going around China with literally briefcases full of money and just buying on spot. Credit, I think, has gone out of the window with purchasing nowadays.
That's very
So
nice.
yeah, it's the big time for change across broad number of
sectors. Many sectors that would be affected.
That's not a good note to end on.
Well, I don't know,
If you need PPE, call us.
Look,
certainly there will be changes, and not necessarily has to be negative. Unfortunately, that could be also positive. That could be beneficial to change as well our perspective to things and to people and how we interact.
absolutely.
So that is the positive note. I think this crisis has put us to look at ourselves and our neighbors in a different way, that perhaps into the rush world that we were living 6-8 weeks ago, perhaps we have a little bit gone far away from kindness and the positive way that we need to look forward to.
Well, that's a lovely note to end. Mike, Alessandra, thank you so much both for your time.
Thank you for having us.
It's been such an interesting conversation. I loved having you both on my show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to you. Thanks.